Canada, the land of maple syrup, crazy races, and if you look hard enough, Brendan Hartley's F1 career. Montreal would play host to round 9 of the 2023 season. It's pretty crazy how quickly it's all come around. I'm personally putting it down to just how enthralling this championship's been so far. Anyway, hey there guys, I'm Will, welcome to FP1 and the Comedy Review, the series whose material wishes it could be as consistent as Max Verstappen. Murky skies would be the order of the weekend in Canada, with rain and disruptions seemingly never far around the corner. That means we've got a lot to sink our teeth into today, so let's get right into the Comedy Review. It's the Canadian Grand Prix. So, news time, and in a first for the Comedy Review, we have drama to do with helmet design. Charles Leclerc planned to roll out a Gilles Villeneuve tribute lid ahead of the race weekend, though it seemed to go missing halfway through Friday. That's because the Villeneuve family weren't a fan of the design, and to be fair, now having to deal with Ferrari, have they not already suffered enough? As it turned out, all Leclerc needed to do was give the family free paddock passes and the photo opportunity just to shut them up for a bit. Moving on, let's talk about Aston Martin. The guys in green had a bit of a wobble last time out in Spain, though we're quick to put that behind them coming into this weekend. Lawrence Stroll revealed he'd invested in new upgrades, and apparently cracked cocaine when he suggested his son Lance was a shoo-in for the podium. Aston weren't the only ones bringing new parts to Canada. Williams also unveiled a new package for Alex Albon. Not Logan Sargent though, and quite frankly, I don't blame them. Alfa Romeo, meanwhile, were busy making upgrades of a different kind, fetching James Key out of a Woking homeless shelter and appointing him as the team's new technical director. James was looking for a fresh start after he was sacked from McLaren earlier this year, and hey, maybe he'll be able to unlock that potential of the Sauber team. You know, it took me far too long to think of that, and it's still shit. Let's just get into first practice, shall we? I mean, what could go wrong here? It honestly felt like FP1 was cursed on Friday morning. My money's on the spirit of the groundhog Latifi flattened last year. Pierre Gasly's Alpine would last all of 5 minutes before it trundled to a halt and brought out the red flag. Fine, here you go. When the Alpine was safely cleared from the track, we all got ready to enjoy some Formula 1 again, though the circuit Gilles Villeneuve seemed to have other ideas. The FIA lost connection with the CCTV cameras around the circuits, claiming they needed these in order to run the event, which I personally think is surprising, given they rarely seem to be paying attention anyway. That meant FP1 was scrapped, with 30 minutes added to second practice to make up for the lost time. For those that cared though, Valtteri Bottas was the one that topped that first session. And to anyone who then headed to the comments of my video on him, using this as evidence to prove me wrong, do us all a favour and take a one-way flight to Switzerland. So FP2 then would be a session of two halves, one where the track was bone dry, and the other where it resembled an Olympic swimming pool. Lewis Hamilton would post the fastest time, though we still didn't have a clue of the real running order. Well, apart from Team LH, of course. Aston Martin, meanwhile, seemed to be lacking the confidence they started the weekend with, mixing Lance Stroll up with a bin bag. Then again, I can kind of see the similarities. Saturday would bring about a new day, though no new changes in the weather, and no changes for Carlos Sainz's form as he threw his Ferrari straight into the barrier. That came after he held up Alex Albon in the Williams, though in his defence, it's hard to tell when they're on a push lap these days. Yuki Tsunoda, meanwhile, was having an eventful morning, as it seemed he'd adopted Nick de Vries' setup when he began looping it around at every opportunity. He did his fair share of blocking as well, upsetting Fernando Alonso and Aston Martin, who seemed to have at least one car on the pace in P3. There was no surprises at the top of the table, however. Max Verstappen on top for Red Bull as we geared up for qualifying. And on the subject of being geared up, that's something Zhou Guan Yu's Alfa Romeo seemed incapable of, grinding to a halt 30 seconds into the session, bringing out a red flag, then magically fixing itself again and driving away. The track had dried somewhat and was improving with every single lap. That being said, getting one in was easier said than done, especially when you've got Carlos Sainz to factor into the equation. He gave Tsunoda a taste of his own medicine, knocking the AlphaTauri man out of Q1. Carlos wasn't quite done yet, however, ruining Pierre Gasly's last effort and knocking him out as well. Fair to say, this didn't make Gasly very happy. De Vries, Sargent and Zhou would make up the Q1 drop zone, as the remaining 15 drivers prepared for the second part of qualifying, and Aston Martin prepared some trauma counselling for Lance Stroll. The Canadian was lucky to miss the barrier here, and this was before the heavens opened halfway through Q2. Before that, there was a tiny window where the drivers could have fitted softs and got a lap in on dry tyres. Given that this is one of the only things Williams are good at these days, they capitalised with Alex Albon, who stormed to the top of the timings in what became an unbeatable lap time. Though while someone gets strategy bang on, someone else has to be the one to cock it up. And for 10 points, have a guess who you think that might have been. Ferrari seemed convinced that intermediate tyres were the right call, and in fairness to them, they were the way to go. Out of Q2, I'm starting to think Gilles Villeneuve could have done a better job with strategy here, and he's been dead for 40 years. Red Bull didn't get things particularly right either, though Max Verstappen's pace saved him in the end. As for Checo, well, he was busy defending his championship challenge again. The Mexican would drop out of Q2 for the third race weekend in a row, joining Leclerc, Stroll, Magnussen and Bottas in the drop zone. That left us with 10 cars in Q3, or in fact make that 9, as Oscar Piastri decided he would rather slam his McLaren into the wall. Before that, Verstappen had of course slotted into P1 from Alonso and Hamilton, though as we waited for the inevitable red flag, there was one last surprise in store. Cue Nico Hülkenberg, the man with the most races without getting on the podium, driving his Haas onto the front row just before the session was suspended, and then getting a penalty and making it all for nothing. The FIA were rather trigger happy on Saturday evening. Alongside Hülkenberg, Sainz, Stroll and Tsunoda were all handed penalties for impeding, or for being Lance Stroll. That gave us an identical front row to the one that we had last season, Verstappen ahead of Alonso. We had a pretty uneventful race in 2022, but hey, let's remain confident, even if only to slightly improve my average watch time analytics. Sunday would see a return to bright blue skies as the lights went out and Verstappen sailed into the lead. Alonso's start wasn't anywhere near as good. He found himself jumped by Hamilton, then fending off George Russell's advances in the second Mercedes. The Spaniard was just able to hold on, as his compatriot Carlos Sainz was locked in a wheel-to-wheel battle with Sergio Perez for 11th place. Oh, how far they've fallen. After nearly killing themselves, then Kevin Magnussen, Sainz would come out victorious as we got to the end of lap 1 and prepared to fall asleep for a bit. And that seemed to be the message for the Williams of Logan Sargent, which forced the American into retirement in the early stages. Saddest part being, this was probably one of his best results to date. Sargent's retirement left us praying for a safety car, though we were only left with the virtual one instead. It's a big thanks then to George Russell, who earned my Driver of the Day vote for slamming himself into the barrier and trying to make this interesting. The resultant safety car brought about chaos in the pit lane. A slow stop for Mercedes, getting them just out ahead of Alonso, who took this opportunity to audition for Brad Pitt's new F1 film as he cried unsafe release. Hamilton and Mercedes would get away with this in the end, though on the bright side, we did get this incredible Toto moment in the process. On the subject of getting away with it, McLaren and Lando Norris wouldn't be so lucky. The Brit trying to build up a gap so that he and Oscar Piastri could successfully double stop, and being slapped with a 5-second unsportsmanlike conduct penalty instead. Some argued that this wasn't fair, and by some I mean 5-year-old girls and Ted Kravitz for some reason. It's a shame really, because Norris was the one providing most of the action out there today, putting great moves on his teammate and K-Mag at the restart before attention turned to Bottas ahead, who was driving so much like Bottas that the commentators thought he had a problem with his car. Further up the road, Alonso was still on the tail of Lewis Hamilton, closing up and passing the 7-time champ on lap 22. At this stage, we were promised that this battle would go back and forth for the rest of the race, so enjoy this image as it's the only time you'll see them again today. We've not spoken about George Russell much since he brought about that yellow earlier. He had got back into the race and was actually having a nice little one given the circumstances, pulling a double overtake on Magnussen and De Vries when the Dutchman used all his Formula E experience to ram the Dane off the circuit. Not working the first time, Nick came back for round 2 and somehow managed to make himself look even worse. With about 20 laps to go then, there's no point looking at Verstappen out front. Instead, we were glued to Alex Albon in 7th. He'd driven an excellent race so far, but now had to fend off a whole host of faster cars behind. That was made easier when George Russell's car died on lap 55, while he did his best to fend off Ocon in the closing laps, Verstappen started to tease us all by seeing how close he could come to crashing in order to get his sponsors some screen time through the replays. Max also was claiming that he had hit a bird during the race, which, if I steal off my favourite tweet from the weekend, is something we'd expect his father to do. One thing Joss never managed to do though was win, and that's what the Dutch Messiah achieved once again, now matching the winning record of Ayrton Senna in the process. Alonso and Hamilton would make up the podium, followed by the two Ferraris, who had amongst all that got the strategy right for once. I'm still not convinced it was deliberate though. And fair play to Alex Albon, who did hold on to P7 to take his best performance since Red Bull threw him out of a Milton Keynes window in 2020. All in all, I've got to say that wasn't a terrible race for 2023 standards. The Verstappen dominance aside, we got a lot of action for P2 and then in the second half of the top 10. Just think at some point this season, Max will have to have an engine failure, so that banger of a Grand Prix is coming soon, I'm sure. Anyway, if you did enjoy the comedy review, be sure to drop it a like and get subscribed. There's been some mega growth on the channel this year, so a huge welcome to all the new and returning viewers out there. I do have to apologise for this video being out a little later compared to my usual standard, and if I'm honest, you may have to grow to expect that for the next few races. I can't say too much on why just for now, but I can assure you that the fast uploads will return properly after the summer break. That's almost all from me for now though. Before that, I want to say a huge thank you to all my patrons and channel members for supporting me, and if you want to get involved in that, all the links you need are down in the description below. I'll be back with the IndyCar comedy review in the next couple of days, but until then, have a good one everybody.